All right. You didn't hear me talk enough yesterday. I'm back again, talking about packaging Tomcat for Linux distributions. Yeah. So I put a link on here to my slides. So the talk from yesterday, the debugging one, and also the packaging talk will be up on people.apache.org site. All right. So my name's Coty. Huh?
Can I take a picture of that?
Yeah, sure.
But in general, for most Apache committers, you have the people.apache.org and then the tilde and their user ID.
Yep.
And then whatever they publish publicly.
Yeah, so I added it to the little home index page too. So if you just go to my index page, you'll find it.
You said you love the spaces in the file names.
I made it look real nice and pretty. All right, so my name's Coty Sullivan. I'm a software engineer at Red Hat. I'm working on Apache Tomcat inside of the JBoss web server project. As you can see, I've worked on this for a while, I guess. I'm an ASF committer and the Tomcat project since 2016. I'm a member, and also I've been the package maintainer or co-maintainer for Tomcat and Tomcat Native and Fedora since 2015. All right, so I'm going to talk about an overview of distributions, why you should use them, depending on your position. The Apache Tomcat distribution, I'll talk about Fedora. I'll talk about Ubuntu a little bit because now the Ubuntu maintainer is also a committer on the Tomcat project, so I don't have to talk about it very much anymore. I had snaps on here the last time I gave this, which was 2 years ago, but I've since dropped that and added Docker containers since everyone seems to be more interested in Docker nowadays. And then we'll have a discussion maybe on some questions. All right. So for the overview, basically all distributions follow the same sort of four-step formula here. They download the source package, except for Docker and some others. They use the binary, the pre-built binaries. Then they build Tomcat and any extras that's needed. Add the OS-specific things like service wrappers for Fedora's systemd, and then distribute that through the package manager for the OS. So, why you should use distributions. They're easy to use and sort of abstract away some of the stuff that Chris was talking about yesterday in his talk. You don't have to worry about file permissions because we handle that at the package level. We have nice things on the OS like SE Linux that can control some file accesses and that sort of thing, so you don't have to worry about that. There's a standard installation. Everything's in a standardized place. There's standardized methods to start and stop and check the status of daemons. So it kind of lets the system administrator use their skills on the particular OS instead of having to learn how to start, stop, and check on Tomcat, on vanilla Tomcat. And I also note sometimes, or usually, system stability, because we don't always provide like the latest and greatest. We pick a specific version, rebase on that, and then as bugs or customers request features or security fixes come out, we pick those small changes and put that into the package instead of continually rebasing. That's only really true for RHEL, because in Fedora, I just rebase to the latest because it's usually pretty stable. So. I don't think Ubuntu stays on the latest builds though. Probably not supposed to do that. All right, so there's some cons since we're doing a list here. There are bugs in the wrapper or OS specific like components that aren't in the ASF distribution. And if you reach out to the Tomcat users list, unless I see it or the maintainer of that package or distribution sees it, then the general like committership on the project doesn't really have too much to offer as far as help with that. Maybe we'll try to generally, but it'd be difficult for developers to understand, add complexity, and requires some of the system administrator skills that I mentioned a second ago. So the Tomcat distribution that we all know and love is really easy. We compile all of the Java stuff and even provide the Windows executables in zip or tarball for the Linux distribution. You grab it, download it, untar it, or extract it, and you can start up immediately. We also provide archives for the API documentation, which is in the docs web app, client deployer, and embedded jars separately. All right, so we're going to switch over and start talking about Fedora a bit. So I'll tell you what an RPM is, in case you don't know. Do a packaging breakdown, directory layout. I'll talk briefly about alternatives because Fedora specifically does some interesting things for the servlet EL and JSP API jars. Talk about installing and configuring, and starting and stopping, checking the status, updating and removing, and then how you can contribute if you'd like. Excuse me. The RPM format is used by the Red Hat flavors of Linux, Fedora, CentOS, RHEL, and it provides a standardized place to install packages or install applications. Everything that's in an RPM is listed in its spec file, which I'll show you in a second. And then we use RPM to build the packages. So I had a link here, but I'm going to pop over to the Fedora distribution here. So these are all of the, you have the sources, so you got the tarball from the ASF, and then several patches and log rotate, service, Sis Config. So all these things are Fedora specific stuff that we include in the package. So I'm going to take a quick look at the spec file, which is horrendously complicated, so I'm going to show you a simpler one in a second. So you can see that gives you the name of the package, some version information, release information, what it is. You can see all the sources listed here and patches. We build this no arch because it doesn't have anything native in it. And then you can see that we have listed all the requirements that you need to build it, like ANT ECJ, and then any other things that it requires at runtime, like Java. The rest of this is talking about subpackages, which I'll touch on in a minute. So I'll just kind of zip down to the bottom here. So in the build phase, for some reason, instead of just using the AMP properties, the person that wrote this initially decided that they wanted to put all the system properties in the spec file, which is kind of ugly, but there's this stuff you don't really need. And then you just move down to the install phase where it puts things where they should go and all that stuff. So look at a simpler one, which is the Tomcat native spec. Compared to the Tomcat Git repository, this only contains a sources file, which is what tells the Fedora infrastructure what to grab and build for it, which is the tarball that I've already downloaded because I'm going to do use RPM build in a bit too, and the spec file. Oops. So here's the Tomcat native spec. As you can see, it requires a lot less. There's the prep and setup phase and build phase, which is like 2 lines. You just call configure and make. And then here's the install phase where it puts the shared objects where they should go. We removed the package config and header files and that sort of stuff because nobody's really using them at this point, I guess. And then that's pretty much it. So very simple in comparison. If you wanted to package your own application, like I think someone mentioned, like a gal was talking about packaging Lucy, like this would probably be a better place to start than Tomcat. All right. Anybody have any questions so far?
Sure. It's a more like bird's eye view question.
Hmm.
So this is the RPM. Do you need to do anything different for a YAM or DNF, or is it all like, or
Nope.
those use the RPM?
Yeah, the RPM is what is used by the system, so DNF or YAM or whatever. It's all handled by the.
And what's the main difference? They resolve dependencies and RPM doesn't, or?
Are you talking about using RPM to install the RPM packages?
YAM versus using YAM versus using the RPM directly, the RPM command.
Yeah, so if you use the RPM command to install this, like it doesn't do any dependency resolution or anything like that.
It's only manage the package, right? If you need to,
Yeah.
you want to track the dependencies of the package, it relies on other libraries. YAM will bring all the dependencies.
So YAM will also install Java, but RPM by
Yeah.
itself no.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and DNF and Yum are like this.
Yeah, it's the same, I think.
Yeah.
This is probably a huge rabbit hole, so maybe we could talk about it later or if you have time at the end.
Sure.
I'm interested, can you bring up the RPM file for TC data again? You said you have like a build phase, which is pretty obvious. That's sort of what you would do if you were just downloading the source yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because you guys will often cherry pick like patches from various places, I assume you start with a vanilla package and then you apply those patches.
Yeah.
Is that something that you can show us at some point?
So, so you can see the patches that are listed here in the spec file at the top, like right underneath the sources. And then later on in the prep phase, which is before the prep phase, which is before the actual build happens, then it executes like the patches in there.
Okay,
You
so
can't.
if
You have to tell it to execute the patches. That you
Right, so if you wanted 25 patches, you would just define where all those patches are and then execute them before the build. Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah, and if you look at like HDVD, I think there's like a ton of custom things that happen. So Tomcat is, luckily for me, pretty easy to build because we don't have too many dependencies or too much craziness going on. So, all right. So we talked about subpackages a bit. So sort of the idea of subpackages or having subpackages in Tomcat is to allow you to have like a minimal installation. You can do just a yum install Tomcat, and that gets you Tomcat, the Tomcat libs package, the JSP servlet, and EL API. I don't know what others are listed twice. Oops. But it gives you like all the API jars, but you don't get manager web app, you don't get the host manager or any of the examples or root or anything. So it's just kind of a minimal, this is what you need, you can drop your application in there and start it up and running. You can install those sub packages separately if you'd like to, which is, I think we have, there's a concept of a yum group, which is just it's created by a metadata file that you can add several packages to, and then you can install that group. I think we have a yum group for Tomcat that will install like all these sub packages too. And I think Chris mentioned JSVC yesterday, and so we have a Tomcat JSVC sub package, which basically just has the dependency on Apache Commons daemon JSVC package and a service script that uses JSVC instead of Tomcat. So nothing really special about it. Just there if people want to use it. So the directory layout follows the file hierarchy standard. This is the same between Fedora and Ubuntu, which I'll point out again later. But this is what your Catalina home would look like. It's in user share Tomcat. Basically just a bunch of symlinks to other places because FHS requires config files and log files to be in specific spots. So that's what that'll look like. So way back in like, I think Tomcat 5 or Tomcat 6. That was about the time that the Fedora Tomcat package came about. And packaging Java applications then was really wonky and weird. But because Tomcat provides the reference implementation of the servlet JSP and EL APIs, they created this thing for alternatives to point to the relevant APIs. So you can see down here, whenever we install the Tomcat package through Yum, there's a phase in the install, or a few steps in the install phase that creates servlet alternatives that points to the servlet API jar for Tomcat. So if you wanted to, you could install just the servlet API jar, and then you could reference that in your application, and the system would know where to grab the servlet API jar from. But that is sort of a legacy thing at this point, and I think I've confirmed that I can't remove it because I don't know that anybody uses it. Tomcat is really sort of difficult to gauge usership because most of the time it just works. I don't have too many people complaining about stuff, so I don't know if I have one user or 100 million users. I don't get too many bugs reported in the Fedora bug trackers. Right, installing and configuring. Generally, you want to use the package manager. So in this case, we're talking about Yum. It's actually, I mean, you can use Yum or DNF. I try and use DNF as much as possible, but Yum is still like stuck in my brain. So see if I actually have it installed. Ah. Try again. Yep. So when you just run an install for Tomcat, assuming this works, so you can see that it's installing the Tomcat package and then it's installing the dependencies here. It's just the servlet APIs, JSP API, and EO API are packaged in their own package. It's just the one jar. Again, because that was a reference implementation before, and if somebody wanted to build an application using the servlet API, they didn't have to download and install all of Tomcat. They could just pick the one jar and use that. And then lib contains like all the other jar files that were in your Catalina home lib directory. And then it also installs a weak dependency. We have a recommends in the Tomcat spec file that recommends that you install Tomcat native. So if you just install it this way, it'll grab that too, apparently. That hasn't always been the case. All right, so while that's going, let's see, talk about that. So we talked about how this is a minimal installation. It doesn't have any of the example web apps or the root web app or anything like that. So you can install those things separately. They're all in their own sub-package. So you see if you wanted to install the admin web app, you would just go install tomcat-admin-web apps or web app. Oh, it's web apps because there's two. It installs the manager and the host manager, even though the host manager is mostly useless, I think. All right, so you can see the installation's done. So I'm going to skip over to configuring. You can define, let's see. So you can define lots of different things in the Tomcat conf at the system level. You can also drop JVM arguments in here, and you can put your Catalina ops in here. You can enable or disable the security manager, which is off by default, and all that sort of stuff in the configuration for the package. So starting and stopping, like I said before, this is the standardized way for the operating system. So you would just do systemctl start Tomcat. Started, probably. Yep. So it's kind of choppy because my terminal is weird, I guess. Yeah, so you can do a quick status to check and make sure that it's started up. You could also, if you wanted to, tell the you could tell the Catalina.date.log file, which is in var log Tomcat for FHS compliance. All right. So yeah, I just went through this. Oh yeah, I forgot. There's also a message. So systemd gives you a message. It's in the Tomcat servlet or service script. It tells you like when it's starting the container, when it's succeeded, and then you stop it. Oh, so updating and removing is pretty easy. When you do a yum update or a yum remove, which is listed here as how to update and remove, we don't replace any of the configuration files. So in Chris's talk yesterday, he talked about having a Catalina home and Catalina base, and then when you do your update, you would create another place and then reference that later. Kind of do the extreme of that and just replace all the jar files in place. So yeah, that's it doesn't replace any configuration files. So we just, whenever there's a new update, we swap out whatever jars need to be swapped and move on. Do you have a question about that? Let's see. Yeah, updating is pretty fast because what I just said, we just kind of like whacking stuff. But if you have a problem,
So
if you have a problem, you can downgrade back to the previous version, like
Yeah.
in the same way.
That would be lovely to put in your slide. Just
Oh, yeah.
How do you downgrade?
Yeah, I didn't have that, so I'll make a note to do that. If there's a problem, you can just downgrade, and it'll drop you back to the previous version that's available, which may or may not be the package that you upgraded from. So that might be an interesting thing to dig into. All right, contributing. If you want, it's generally pretty quiet, but you can go and take a look at the Fedora project, Tomcat and Tomcat native overview pages if you'd like to contribute or if you'd like to learn more or ask questions. That's where you can do it. I think we use the Pager now, so if you wanted to open an issue there to ask a question. All right, moving on to the Ubuntu distribution. Talk about Debian packages, packaging breakdown, basically the same that I just went through with Fedora. But I'll talk about some comparing and contrasting things between the two, and then contributing here too. This is not what I do like regularly, so this took me a bit to like, kind of put together, but it all follows FHS and it's pretty much the same as Fedora, so that's nice. So we'll talk about the Debian format. It includes 3 files: Debian binary, control tar.gz, and data tar.gz. 2 of them are metadata, and the third contains the installable artifacts. This is what the contents of a Debian file would look like. So we would get it with the apt-get download command here. Goes out and pulls the .deb file, and then you can use dpackage-c to list the contents. So you can see it looks like pretty much the same as the Fedora Tomcat package. The main difference is that Ubuntu has Tomcat 7, 8, and 9 packages, but with Fedora we don't have a version modifier or qualifier in the package name, so we rely on the RPM version system to like maintain that instead of having like a specific major package. All right. So again, it follows the same idea that minimalism is good. It doesn't have the sort of one-off API packages like Fedora does. It just has the 2 library packages here. One of them is embedded, one of them is just the Java stuff. And then it does have admin, docs, examples, and so on. So I already talked about this. This is what your Catalina home and the Debian Tomcat 9 package would look like. It's in varlib Tomcat 9. It also has not as many symlinks, but still has symlinks to different places to where your configuration lives and your logs live and your cache live. So they're both, Ubuntu and Fedora both follow FHS, and they both have pretty easily manageable packages. Yum for Fedora and apt for Debian and Ubuntu. Let's see. I don't think this is still accurate, but whenever I had first written this a couple years ago, Ubuntu was still using the sysv implementation or sysv scripts to start and stop Tomcat. I think that now they use sysv as well. So, yeah, should be exactly the same between the two. All right, so this is how you would install and configure Tomcat. I have a VM to do this, but I don't know if you guys want me to. I can spin it up and show you, but it's pretty much the same. You would apt install Tomcat 9 or Tomcat 9 admin, and then systemctl start stop. Oh yeah, I created this slide, so I did know that systemd worked already. I just did this like 2 days ago.
I've used this also.
And then updating and removing is the same. I assume that downgrade will work the same as well. I test that later. And then contributing, so again, I'm not a maintainer of the Ubuntu package. We do have a committer on the Tomcat project that is the maintainer or a maintainer. But this link here is the place you would go to check out the sources or the build files or ask questions. All right. Now for something that I don't know as much about, but everybody seems interested in, so I've been poking around with it some. We'll talk about Docker a bit. We don't maintain the Docker image. We being the ASF Tomcat project, we don't maintain the image. That's handled by the Docker folks. But it's pretty straightforward and works really nicely. So that was nice of them to do. So we'll talk about installing and configuring, and the configuring is virtually minimal. Starting, stopping, updating, and contributing. kind of followed the same flow as the other distributions, even though a couple of these things don't really make sense.
If we want to change the Debian to
What?
so that we will maintain the Docker.
Oh, yeah, I don't know if we want to take that on, but we can talk about it on the PMC list.
That's,
Yeah. All right, so I got a definition of Docker here from opensource.com, just in case you guys don't know. It's a tool designed to make it easier to create, deploy, and run applications by using containers. In this context, we're talking about Docker containers, not serverless containers. That bites me a lot. When I talk about containers, generally I'm talking about a JVM or a serverless container and not Docker. So yeah, the information for the Docker container distribution can be found on Docker Hub. So these are all the supported container images that are available right now, and then a couple of references for that. And then I also have a link to the Docker library on GitHub, and then the Docker file for Tomcat 9 using Java 8, which we can take a look at real quick. So they, in this particular one, there's several other JDKs they use, but in this one, they use the base of the OpenJDK 8 container. You can see they define their Catalina home as your local Tomcat. I found a couple of other variables because they also compile Tomcat native. They grab GG key so they can check the zip or the tarball, which one they use, and make sure that they got it from the correct place. Define versions, and then go through their sort of install and build phase. Most of this is building, or all of this is building Tomcat native, so it's only this complicated because it needs Tomcat native. If you're just using Tomcat, then it would just be an unzip and drop it where you want it to live and start it. So then at the end, they expose port 8080, and the command to run is catalina-sh run. So whenever you start up a Docker container for Tomcat, it runs in the foreground. You have to tell it if you want it to run in the background. Questions? All right, so installing a Docker image for Tomcat is as simple as a Docker install. I listed this here as using Docker pull because we're talking about installing and not necessarily starting, so I wanted to break those apart. But you can do a Docker run Tomcat and specify the version to download it and start it at the same time. And I mentioned configuring because that was kind of following the layout that I had for Fedora and Ubuntu, but configuring for your Docker container is just simply setting up your Docker file to do what you need it to, and then configuring Tomcat as you normally would. So, no big deal. So, Alright. I'm going to start up a Docker container here. We're in the foreground, so not -d. Still, I don't do this very much. But of course, as soon as I try to show this, it like dies.
You have your old Tomcat still running.
What? Oh. No.
System control.
Is it container list?
Your syntax is right.
LS.
You're already listening on
LS.
80.
Oh.
No?
What?
You get to like 80, 81.
Do ls-a. See, maybe it's a good container.
Ha!
Anyway.
What? I must have had some.
You probably already had the top there.
Ha! That's what it was. Okay. So yeah, you can see it starts up, does a normal Tomcat startup. It includes all of the web applications. So you've got the manager app, push manager, examples, root, blah blah blah. Also dropped my application bad app in here from my debugging demo yesterday. And that was done with this little teeny tiny Docker file that extends the Tomcat 9 base. Just literally copied my application into the Catalina Home Web Apps directory, and you can start it up and run from there. I did create a slightly more complicated one, but this is probably bad practice. I created an actual real web application, not just a couple of JSPs. And so using the Tomcat 9 Java 8 base for this one because Maven didn't behave if you try and use Java 11 for some reason. But I'm actually installing Maven on the container, creating an directory for the app to live, running the Maven package, and then copying the resulting war into the Tomcat web app directory. I think that makes for a really bloated container, so you probably shouldn't do this. I think you would build first and then basically remove all of this stuff and just have a copy of the target war in the place. But just for poking around with it, so that was kind of fun. Updating, again, same as configuring. You do all that stuff in your Docker file, so it's not as, I guess, easy to do as a OS distribution like Fedora. So yeah, here's an example that I just mentioned. I already showed you the Docker file for it and showed you it starting up, so there's no reason to do that again. And then I also did the more complex example, so that's good. And then if you want to contribute, it's maintained by the Docker community, so it's on the Docker library GitHub here. And I mean, it seems pretty straightforward as far as their maintenance of this, so I don't know how much they have going on there. Alright, discussions. I had this question whenever I asked, or whenever I presented this a couple years ago at ApacheCon in Miami. But does anybody have any suggestions on how distribution maintainers can provide better stuff? I mean, you brought up the, or I guess I talked myself through the update downgrade thing, but
I do have a question.
Sure.
You didn't show it here unless I missed it, but if you wanted to do a split configuration, how do you do that? And does the distribution make that easy, or does it kind of fight against you?
So we have.
Let's assume that you don't want to deal with multiple versions at the same time. You just choose to have a split anyway.
So we have this varlib tomcats directory that's created whenever the service is installed, and you can control your Catalina home or Catalina base directories in your Sis Config. So if you wanted to, you could basically copy all of your stuff into a directory underneath here or anywhere else really, but this is kind of like the system provided place to do it.
Okay.
And then you could use the service that points your Catalina base or home.
Home is the
So
the
it points
master, and
your
base is your config that you're putting
So
together.
then it will point your Catalina base to wherever you have it. And so when you run an update, it updates the one fixed location, but then your configuration lives somewhere else and your service is configured to point to that somewhere else. So it's not super difficult, but it's not something I also do very often.
So you have to know that varlib tomcats is sort of the right place on Fedora to put your.
Kinda. I mean, you're not limited to putting your stuff in there. So let's see.
Right, but that's where you, as a backup maintainer, would encourage people to put their stuff.
Yeah.
And
But for no particular reason. I think it was pretty arbitrary.
okay.
But that's
I
just
mean, what you sort of want to do is not surprise people. And so if there's a well-known location where your stuff should be on Fedora, it's good to know.
Yeah.
So is that documented anywhere, or do you kind of have to read scripts?
I don't think it's documented anywhere. It's been there for a while. I mean, a lot of the stuff has been there since Tomcat 6, and previous maintainers just didn't want to bother with it too much, but I've been removing quite a bit of things, so I'm quite ambitious, I guess, in that area. But I was going to look and see. So you have the Sis Config, which overrides Tomcat conf for each system service. So each service, which is cheat. I never remember where system keeps stuff. So you can see that it points to the environment file. So we also provide this thing, which you can use, like make copies of this app one, and you can have.
So it's a template.
Yeah, it's a template, and this %i here is what you make a copy of it where you start. I don't remember exactly how that works, but anyway, it's like a template, and with very minimal effort, and after creating your Catalina base, like the notes up here say, you can just say systemctl start tomcat at like A or B or whatever, and then it knows to point to the configuration file that tells it where Catalina base is, and you can have multiple instances running that way.
So you have a different service name, or you
Yeah.
sort of decorate the existing service name?
Yes, you'd have to decorate it. Let's try. Interesting.
You have to create the config file first.
I was gonna say if it would fail, so yeah, it failed miserably. And it didn't record it here, so. No. No, what's up, man? Thanks.
I don't think you can see it. That's where you look at chat.
Oh, yeah, right.
Template it. This is the unit file.
Does that work? Yeah. So yeah, it tells you that I can't find a varlib tomcats conf server XML, so it pointed to the alternate location instead of the one. But it didn't work quite the way I expected it to, because I expected it to try and do something like this, but it looked in just conf, so it was kind of strange. And probably is misbehaving. But I don't know that anybody uses this. Again, it's hard for me to tell like who is using what, because it seems to just work fine and nobody's screaming at me. So. But yeah, that's
Put it in
the
a bug then.
general idea. Huh?
Gotta put in a bug and see the complaints.
Right, yeah. That'd be something interesting to fix. I think I talked way too fast and I ended 10 minutes early, but that's better than 20, so. Does anybody have any questions or comments, concerns? I think I might have more slides, but. Yeah, I can show you the,
Experience.
do what?
I know that
Hmm.
so
Yep, yeah, you can see what changes. You have a whole log. Mhm.
When you upgrade Xeon, you have also RPA save files,
Mhm.
configuration files,
Yeah,
and check what's
right. Mhm. Yeah, we have, whenever you do an update, you get an RPM new file for things that we deem are configuration, like pretty much everything in conf. So you can compare that to what you have and see if it's different. Generally, not really. And we don't do major upgrades like in a Fedora stream. So unless you're using Rawhide, you're not going to jump from like 8.5 to 9 or 7 to 9 or 8.5 or 9 and potentially break your config. But yeah, I can show you guys a quick RPM build if you want.
I have a couple of questions.
Shoot. Can I ask you about Docker?
That's for later. With respect to package management and packages in Linux, first of all, if I build, let's say I build, it can be any product. I want to specify actually not a JVM, something that does have an architecture dependency. What are the main differences if I build it, let's say, on Fedora and I want to distribute it so somebody with Debian will be able to use? What is it, just dependencies?
Yeah, I think the package names are generally pretty different. I mean, they're both FHS compliant, so stuff lives in like the same place, but package names, versioning, as you can see between Fedora and Ubuntu, we have a Tomcat package and they have a Tomcat 9 or a Tomcat 8 or a Tomcat
If
7.
I build like a fat bin, like we discussed, a fat jar,
Yeah,
that should work.
maybe. I don't know.
And another question, can you briefly talk about the other packages, the new ones like Snap and Flatpak? How they compare? Are you familiar with them?
I looked at Snaps a little bit, just enough to write like a few slides before, but I was over a year ago, so I've kind of purged that from memory.
Okay.
I could probably talk to you about it later after I like kind of give
Sure.
myself a refresher, but not right now.
Okay, that's fine.
And then, so let's look at my Twitter, my Facebook. Oh, actually. So here's the Tomcat build system, or the Fedora build system tool. So each one of those, the spec file is pretty much the same between different versions. I mean, we have a branch for each one, so I have to pick changes, usually just merge across. But what I wanted to show is that for Tomcat, there's no arch, so it just builds the one. But for Tomcat Native, we're using native stuff. Once you initiate a build, you can control the architectures, and since I didn't define anything here, it builds for all the available arches. And then that's the wrong one. There we go. So RPM build just like kind of executes all of the things that we went over in the spec really quickly and generates a couple different RPMs. You have the main RPM, which has a shared object, but then you get the debug source and debug info RPMs and the SRPM as well. And that's only built for Fedora 30 because that's what I'm running on. But you can use the Fedora infrastructure tools Fed package to mock build for any of the other architectures or systems that are available to you. So I could build like locally a package for Fedora 29 or Fedora 31 by using mock, which is pretty neat. Actually, before I learned about using mock build, I had like a VM for each one of the distributions I was building from, and like a couple scripts, so I could quickly just say I want to build for that. But then I learned about mock build, and it works quite nicely. So don't do that anymore. Cool. A nice thank you slide. If you have, oh man.
Oops.
Does it go backwards? Nope. All right. Anyway, I'm going to show you here. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, whatever, you can email me. Here's my email address. You can also tweet at me. Full name, Coty Sutherland. I'm on LinkedIn and GitHub and all that jazz too. I'm usually pretty available and free to talk about Tomcat related things, so feel free to ask any questions anytime. And that's it. Thank you for the audience participation, helping me not look so bad.